friends and comrades, and welcome to another episode of the End of Sport podcast. My name is Nathan Coleman Lamb, and I'm joined by tons of friends today, including Derek Silva. Derek, how you doing?
Very, very well. Excited for this conversation.
Anna Posberg. Anna, how you doing?
I'm so good. Also very excited for this conversation.
Priyash, how about you?
Good. I'm doing well. I can't wait to learn all about Winter Olympics from Jules.
Yeah, I hope you're excited. Everyone's excited. Better be excited. Well, our guest of honor today is another really good friend, great friend, best friend of the podcast, Jules Boykoff, author of really honestly a million things. He's even writing another book this month. It's just, I can't even list the books anymore. It's totally absurd. But Jules, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be with you all.
Well, here's the thing. I'll be honest. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening in the world of sports. We've been thinking a lot about the World Cup, because of all the horrific situation in the United States. But there's also an Olympics happening. That's the reason why we're having this podcast. It's happening in Italy. It's a Winter Olympics, which people sometimes get a little bit less excited about. Although I shouldn't say that as a Canadian. Like, Canadians try to get really excited about it because we do disproportionately well at this Olympics versus the summer version. But Jules, you do know what's going on at these Olympics. So I would love it if you started us off. Just tell us, what should we be thinking about when it comes to this edition of the Winter Games in Milano?
Thanks. Well, it's interesting, I think, to maybe start with the fact that there were numerous cities that were bidding on the 2026 Winter Olympics, and they dropped out. So you had Calgary, you had Sion in Switzerland, Graubünden, Innsbruck, Graz. That's a lot of cities that were interested, but maybe they had a ballot measure and people in the city said, no, thanks, we don't want the Olympics in our town. And so really kind of this ended up in the pocket of Milano-Cortina, Cortina d'Ampezzo, kind of be out of default in certain respects. They certainly put forth a bid and everything, but there were a lot of other people that said no, thank you to the Olympics. I think the other thing is just that the Olympics occur in this heavily politicized pocket. I think it's fair to argue that when you take these three most recent Olympics together, the ones in Milano-Cortina, the prior ones in Paris that was happening amid a genocide in Gaza, and then the war in Ukraine, and then the one before that where there were human rights violation questions in Beijing. This could be the most politically inflected set of Olympics in a very long time, maybe going all the way back to the early 1980s when we were seeing the boycotts around between the Soviet Union and the United States and all their friends. So for me, it's an exciting time to have the Olympics come around in the sense that we might see politics actually pop up despite the best efforts of the IOC. So I think that's kind of my opening salvo. I'm also keeping a very close eye on what's going to be happening to U.S. athletes. I think that there's a very good chance that they're going to find themselves in the geopolitical crossfire. If you saw the NBA basketball game the other day that happened in London, when they sang the U.S. national anthem, there were people at that NBA game shouting things like, don't invade Greenland, and then the whole crowd kind of getting behind them. So I think there's actually a very good chance that athletes might find themselves politicized at these games, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely going to get into those discussions. We have a couple questions on ice and ice's participation in these Olympics. But before that, just another kind of, I guess, introductory question. We know that the Winter Olympics are a little bit a relatively smaller scale than the Summer Olympics, but they're no less embedded in like the broader Olympic movement, as you've pointed out, and the sort of the engagement with the Olympics in this process of capital accumulation. How would you contrast the peculiarities of the winter from the summer games? And do our political interventions protesting these games and in response to particular challenges, do they differ when it's the Winter Olympics versus the Summer Olympics?
Well, first, the Winter Olympics are a much smaller event. There'll be about 3,500 athletes in Milano-Cortina for these games, whereas there was more than 12,000 at the most recent Summer Olympics. The second thing related is that there are fewer countries that participate in these Olympics. It's much less of a global affair, much more dominated by North America and Europe, with also some Asian countries heavily involved. But, I would say that's a good place to maybe start. So it's really not as big of a global event in some ways, but it raises a lot of the same questions about who wins and who loses. It often comes down to which countries have the most money. I mean, if you look at the medal tables for the Olympics, whether it's winter or summer games, it definitely shows you that money very much matters. And so that's something I'm going to be looking at. They also are going to have a small number of athletes from countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has its own National Olympic Committee, and they're sending people there. There's going to be 2 athletes from Haiti as well. I don't expect them to necessarily medal, but it's good from the perspective of the International Olympic Committee to get that kind of involvement from other countries. But the fact that I could just list off the athletes from these countries pretty quickly says that there's really not that many of them. I guess the other thing I would say that's kind of interesting to keep an eye on in that regard is how Kirsty Coventry handles all this. Kirsty Coventry is the new president of the International Olympic Committee. She is a highly decorated swimmer from Zimbabwe. I should mention she's a highly decorated white swimmer from Zimbabwe who very much follows in the footsteps of her mentor, Thomas Bach, the previous IOC president. And she's already getting a ton thrown at her from allegations around Casey Wasserman, the head of the LA 28 Olympics, who found his name in the Epstein files quite a bit, to some of the questions that we've already been talking about here: inclusion, exclusion, what about Russia and Belarus? So it's going to be really interesting to see how she reacts. JD Vance and Marco Rubio are part of the contingent that are coming from the United States to these games. How will she interact with those folks when she gets around those people?
You mentioned that, how I guess in a way it has been a bit of a tumultuous start for Kirsty Coventry. And, if the IFC's friendly relationship with a unit of ice isn't enough, as we've already mentioned, we now also have this news breaking out of Casey Wasserman's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Wasserman, of course, is the chair of the 2028 LA Olympics and Paralympics Organizing Committee. I'm sure you have much to say about Wasserman, who knows whose appearance in the files was of little surprise to those of us who followed his career. The IOC president, Kirsty Coventry, could only bring herself to term this leak as a sad distraction. So there was some sense of optimism when Kirsty Coventry came to take charge of the IOC. So whatever happened to that change that, she was supposed to herald?
Well, I do not think she is going to bring change. I know there was a lot of hype when she was elected. She was the first woman elected as president of the International Olympic Committee. I mean, this is an organization that didn't allow women to even be members until 1981. So this is not to be confused with some sort of proto-feminist organization here. She is basically Thomas Bach 2.0 in a lot of ways. She started a working group that's called Protecting the Female Category. I think the very language involved in that says everything you need to know. But here's another thing you should know, which is that working group is not going to be named publicly, apparently. So it's going to be a secretive, clandestine working group. None of that speaks well to the possibilities of Kirsty Coventry being a powerful voice, a courageous voice in the face of power with these Olympic Games. So you'll hear a lot of hype around Kirsty Coventry. You'll hear a lot of hype that she's going to bring a new era to the Olympics. But I'd bring a healthy skepticism to that hype when you hear it, because I do not see a big change. I'm ready to be surprised, but I would be shocked. I wouldn't even be surprised. I'd be shocked if she brought us some new direction.
Yeah, Jules, and I think the points you're making about Kirsty Coventry being Thomas Bach 2.0 and like this working group is so problematic on so many levels. Like, when we think about good governance principles, this in no way adheres to it and is so problematic on multiple levels. And what I think is really interesting, and when we think about like the power of the image of the IOC and the Olympics, they have this thing like the Olympic truce of like this bringing harmony to everything and bringing everyone together. And it popped up the other day. The Washington Post had a piece that said the UN was calling for a 52-day pause on all wars for the games to ensure safe passage for athletes and officials attending the events in Italy. Can you comment on that? Like, not just, I don't want to like say the ridiculousness of it, but almost like the mirage and the just image of the fake superficial image of this. And yeah, I'm trying to piece through what to think about this, because yeah, obviously we want peace, but this just seems bizarre.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite French theoreticians gave it a long time ago. The spectacle is not a collection of images, it is a social relationship between people that is mediated by images. And I think of the UN truce as part of this social relationship that we know is a total hoax and a joke. The history goes back to Greece, where athletes, as you mentioned, were allowed safe passage to the Olympics theoretically. It was revived in the 1990s during the Bosnian War, Kosovo situation. And every 2 years, dutifully, the United Nations passes a resolution that says there's going to be no war during this bracketed time around the Olympics. Well, first, for starters, by the way, back when the 2002 Olympics happened in Salt Lake City, the United States passed a resolution that said, nah, you know what? We're having this invasion of Afghanistan, whether you like it or not, and we're not going to hit the pause button. And of course, they've never hit the pause button, my country, the United States, for any Olympics. So the ultimate joke of the Olympic truce happened in 2014 when the Sochi Winter Olympics were happening. And between the Olympics and Paralympics, Vladimir Putin and Russia invaded Crimea. I mean, this was happening right in the middle between the Olympics and Paralympics. So basically, if you believe in the Olympic truce, I have a stable of unicorns that I want to sell you. And it's just like kind of a joke through and through is what I'm trying to say. Now, that's not to say it's a little bit of aspiration in there, but let's be real, especially at this time with a bellicose United States threatening all these different countries, including allies around the world. There's really nothing to the Olympic truce. I mean, Sergio Mattarella, the president of Italy, said, let the aggression and barbarism stop because of the Olympic truce. I love that idea, but I just don't see it happening.
Obviously, we can see that the Olympic truce is a farce. You also brought to our attention to this really important point about the scale of the Winter Games, which is the question of it's not it is an international event, but it's not a truly global event. But the global crisis, and especially in this present moment, is still imposing itself in different ways. So just two examples come to mind. We recently learned that a unit of ICE, Homeland Security investigations, will be deployed to assist with security operations in the host cities of Milano-Cortina. And then there has been obviously much noise made by the Italian far right over the rapper Gali's appearance at the upcoming opening ceremony for his anti-genocide remarks. In what ways do you think the prevailing crisis of which we are quite aware in this moment of the global world order imposing itself on this 2026 Winter Games?
Yeah, well, everybody knows the Gramsci quote. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appears, and we're definitely seeing that here manifesting in the Olympics. I mean, you gave two good examples. I would just pause for a second with the ice thing. I mean, I realize it's a great chance for the mayor of Milan to push back and say, that all these things that are true about ice, how horrible they are and everything. But ICE was at the Paris Olympics and nobody said anything. The FBI and other security agents from the United States have been at Olympics for decades and no one's really said all that much about it. For me, these Olympics are all about continuity, and I think that's just kind of an example of it. I mean, every single Olympics in the 21st century has, you've seen local and national police forces use the games to get all the special weapons and laws they'd never be able to get during normal political times, and Italy is no exception. They're spending millions upon millions, hundreds of millions of euros to fortify these Olympics, and they're not going to put these special weapons back in the box. You're going to see special robots, surveillance drones that are purchased just for these Olympic Games. You're going to have a counterterrorism center that's looking at online activity as well. These are all things that are being refined during the Olympic moment to be used afterwards. And so in that respect, I see a lot of continuity. Now, with the Italian rapper, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, he said pretty basic things about stopping a genocide that's happening in Gaza, that you have any number of organizations that say, yes, it's a genocide. And if he wants to stop a genocide, that shouldn't be very controversial. And yet you have the sports minister from Italy saying that, well, I can disagree with this guy's statements and still have him be speaking at, or, performing at the opening ceremony. And then saying, well, but I know he's not going to say anything about that situation in Gaza. Well, really, do you know that? I mean, how do you know that? It seems like you're is this a veiled threat of some sort? Are you just acting like an Italian macho guy? I don't really know exactly how to read that, but it definitely seems like they're trying to control his behavior. And I will be eagerly watching to see if he has the courage to stand up in that moment and say some truth. But yeah, I mean, the geopolitics are really interesting around these Olympic Games, and maybe, just maybe, I doubt it, but just maybe, finally, we'll get someone from the International Olympic Committee to admit that their stance of neutrality is actually kind of a joke. I mean, in these geopolitical times, being neutral, as it's always been in any geopolitical times, actually means siding with the powerful most of the time. So you can say that you're neutral, as Howard Zinn used to talk about. You can't be neutral on a moving train. Well, the train is definitely moving, and it's moving toward fascism. If you don't say anything, you're moving toward fascism too, and doing your own thing to contribute to it.
Totally. And just to quickly pick up on a point that you made there, Jules, I just learned today that, you had pointed out that various American security services have been intimately involved with the games overseas for decades, right? Including in Paris and much more recently. I just learned that the Department of Homeland Security, which again, and I think we have to be really clear about this, because the slogans around ICE are good. Like, I abolish ICE, yes. Like, objectively, that's not even rhetorical. I mean, we absolutely have to do that. That's the correct political goal. But it's more than that, because it actually should be abolish DHS, right? This is the key. Department of Homeland Security includes Border Patrol, who are, by the way, responsible for the murders in Minnesota, right? It includes CBP, who is responsible for much of the depravity at the border. It includes TSA, who have been harassing people going through security in airports since 9/11, at least, right? I mean, the entire Department of Homeland Security is an abomination, and it is like the instrument of this fascist regime, right? And I say all that because it turns out I'm a Canadian. You right now, Jules, you're in Canada. Many of us are in Canada right now. 4 of the 5 of us are in Canada. Jules is in Toronto. Shout out to Toronto and Jules being there. I can't believe I'm in New Brunswick while you're in Toronto, but anyway, that's a separate gripe. No, Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, Montreal all have Department of Homeland Security offices. I've lived 40-some years, more than 40 years of my life in Canada. I didn't know that until today, right? So this is something that I think that needs to be on everyone's radar, just the way that these American security tentacles are really strangling the world and are part of the machinery of fascism today.
Yeah, I mean, just the very language of this notion of the homeland is problematic in a lot of ways. Oh, Canada, our home and native land. I mean, like, what's up with that, folks? I can say that now that I'm in Toronto, maybe.
No, let me say this, Jules. You know what the kids have started saying? A lot of the times when the national anthem is happening in schools, the kids are saying our home on native land.
Wonderful.
Props to the kids.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, the thing is with our Department of Homeland Security in the United States, it hasn't been around that long. So, it shouldn't be that difficult to get rid of. It's not like you're asking to get rid of a whole branch of government here. And there's real motion in the United States like I've never seen before, where people in Minnesota who I've known for a long time. I used to play professional soccer in Minnesota for a team called the Minnesota Thunder. This was pre-MLS era. A lot of the guys I played with are still with the organization in Minnesota United. I've been in contact with them. Some of them, I'm not going to name them in case they'd be uncomfortable, but they've been out in the streets. And there's been a radicalization of people in Minnesota, which has been incredible to see, eyes wide open to the very things that you're talking about, Nathan. And so for that, I mean, it's a really important moment. It's just, how do you leverage that into actual abolishment? How do you leverage that into actual change that will make the United States a little bit better? And I think having a conversation around this very term of homeland is important in and of itself.
Well, I think it's also important too, like Jessie Diggins, who, like, my soft flex is that Jessie and I were on the cross country and track teams together for 2 years because we went to high school together. But she actually, so she's from Minnesota. She lives in our hometown still in Minnesota, right outside of Minneapolis. She had a post and like turned off the comments and was like, the things going on in Minneapolis are horrific. And like, I stand with my community, and immigrants make our city and our country great. And I think I saw, I don't remember which athlete it was this morning, but posted on their social of like, Rule 50 is bullshit. Like, this is political and we need to take a stand on this. And like, I have this platform to talk about what is going on and I'm going to use it. And so, to build on your point too, Jules, like when we think about winter sports in the US, especially Minnesota, like we field the hockey team, cross country ski team, bobsled team, curling team, like they all have ties to Minnesota. And I am really curious, especially with like Rule 50, and I think the IOC quietly shifting it with asterisks of like their view on political protest at the Olympics. I am really curious to see athletes, especially those with ties to Minnesota, what they're going to do. Because I don't think it's an if anymore. I think it's a what now with everything going on.
That's such a great point. I love that, and I'll be especially eager now that you've primed me to that to watch. For listeners, I know you have a very highly intelligent audience, listeners and viewers now. But just to backstep, if I may, with Rule 50 that you mentioned there, that's the one that says you can't engage in political speech in Olympic venues or other areas. I always have to add that, or other areas. Like, that's pretty capacious definition for starters. But anyways, it started, after not just when Smith Carlos did their thing at the 1968 Olympics, and when Naomi Tayus also did her thing at the 1968 Olympics, wearing black shorts instead of the officially issued white shorts. But it really kind of moved into gear after 1972, when Vincent Matthews and Wayne Collette stood on the medal stand after winning their race in track and field and looked very disinterested. They broke Olympic protocol. They stood on the same pedestal. You're supposed to be hierarchical in terms of your medals. They stood on the same pedestal. They looked very different, disinterested, rubbing their chins. One of them was twirling their medals. They just walked off and were banned promptly by the International Olympic Committee for 50 years. But what they also did, the IOC, was they created this rule that you alluded to, Anna, that is capacious in its definition, has been slightly tweaked over time, especially after the moment of athlete activism in 2020, when the pressure was really on, and the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee said that they weren't going to crack down on athletes who use their political speech. The IOC, the International Olympic Committee, said, whoa, okay, yeah, we'll give you a little bit more space to speak out. You still can't do so on the field of play, but you can take a knee if you wish before the match starts. You can speak freely in these open zones, these press zones. It's not great. It's not thorough, but it does show that the International Olympic Committee can change these rules basically whenever they want to. They only do, however, when they get pressure from athletes and from people from these different National Olympic Committees that back their athletes.
Another friend of the show, Maddie Orr, has spoken a lot about, and came on the show to talk about how the Paris Olympics in 2024, they were the sort of they claim to be the sort of bastion of the greenest Olympics ever, right? They told everyone that they were an incredibly environmentally friendly Olympics, and I think we have to note that was a false claim, or at very least a massively misleading claim. I'm curious if you've heard. Has Milano-Cortina also kind of positioned itself as a sort of beacon of greenwashing, if you will? And
Yeah, they definitely are in Milano-Cortina, claiming to be environmentally sustainable. That's pretty much what every Olympics does. We'll see it again in Los Angeles 2028. Even though there's no train system to get people around, that'll be, there's a train system, LA people, don't get me wrong, some love their train system, but it's not like Paris or something like that. I mean, I think actually, and Maddie Orr, incredible work. I actually got to see Maddie Orr briefly in Paris. So I want to tell a quick Paris story and then I'll come back. With Paris, what was really interesting and I think instructive for thinking through the IOC's brand of green is that there's like a little bit of sometimes truth to it. So remember the whole Seine River, where they were going to clean up the river in time for the Olympics, which is an awesome idea. Like, that'd be awesome to have a river clean that no one's been able to swim in for like 100 years. It would be an actual quote unquote legacy for everyday people. You don't have to be rich to hop in the river. And they kept testing the water over and over again. It kept coming up, dud, dangerous, don't get in there. When I was in Paris writing with my colleague Dave Zirin for The Nation, and we interviewed a guy from the Surf Rider Foundation, one of the organizations that was doing the monitoring of the water. And they told us something that blew our minds. And that was, they were only testing the water in Paris, the Seine River, for E. coli and enterococci. They were only testing for 2 bacteria. They weren't testing for like toxic metals. They weren't testing for runoff from farm pesticides. None of that stuff. All they were testing for was 2 bacteria. God knows what was floating around in that Seine River that the athletes went in and now that Parisians are apparently recreating in. We asked that person from the Surfrider Foundation, would you go into the river? This is when it was testing clean. He was like, hell no, I wouldn't go in that river. And if he's saying that, I think that kind of says it all. So skittering forward to the current Olympics here in Milan, yeah, they're talking a big environmental game like usual, but they built a sliding track in Cortina that involved cutting down all these ancient trees that, hundreds of them. They have a company called NEENI. It's an Italian fossil fuel company that's a sponsor. I mean, how do you even have fossil fuels as your sponsors? So I think with these Olympics, they're not talking about it quite as much, but you're sort of obligated these days if you're going to host Olympics to claim for them to be green. But no, these Olympics are far from it. And as Madeline Orr rightly points out time and again, when the Olympic committees create these different claims around being green, they don't include in their tabulations the emissions that come from people traveling to the games. Like one of the biggest sources of emissions, according to some 80% of the emissions of the games are people, athletes, fans, coaches, tourists traveling to these Olympic Games. Those don't even count at all. So yeah, I mean, it's easy to say that you're the smartest person in the world when you cut everybody else in the world out. And so I think that's just something we want to be aware of. It is another green dream. Another thing about it, it's the most sprawling Olympics in history. It's all across these Alps, and that's going to mean more travel. There's been a ton of infrastructure development. I must say, when these Olympics were pitched, they were pitched at a cost of 1.5 billion euros, 1.5 billion euros. Well, because they're doing all this infrastructure that you need to get everybody around to this most sprawling Olympics, it's more like 6 billion euros now. So again, it's conforming to that trend, not just greenwashing like we're talking about, but also this sort of idea of etch-a-sketch economics, where during the bid phase, you say it's going to cost one thing, and you shake up that etch-a-sketch once you get the Olympics and you write a brand new number, which is inevitably much higher. So it's conforming to all those trends. And one last point just related to this that I think fits with what you're asking about the sustainability stuff is in economic sustainability. There has been a ton of alleged graft, I should say, for the lawyers listening, alleged graft, even including the mafia in Italy as well, around some of the contracts and subcontracts with these Olympics. Last thing I'll say is that there's this group called Open Olympics 2026, a group of public administration scholars and transparency advocates who've opened a portal because there was no one who was tracking all of these different construction projects around the Olympics. No one was tracking, therefore, whether they were even green at all. And they found like well over half of these projects never even underwent an environmental impact assessment. So it's really hard to say that these are green Olympics when you're not even assessing the environmental elements of these various construction projects, and you're chopping down trees along the way. And activists have been saying these are the least sustainable Olympics in modern history. And I actually interviewed an activist, a guy named Luca Trada, who's with this group. They're called the Unsustainable Olympic Committee, they call themselves. It sounds better, I'm sure, in Italian. And they're doing a big march the day after the Olympics open, which should be really interesting. And one of their main themes is what you're asking about, which is the sort of greenwashing that's enmeshed in these Olympics in Italy.
The sustainability thing is really interesting for me when we think about the comparison of Winter and Summer Olympics too, because when Winter Olympics are held in places, the Olympics, of course, in Italy, there is snow, but the IOC purports that it wants to expand and be more global and have this kind of global image. And so they're looking at places, India, Brazil, places that do not have snow. And when we think about sustainability in creating snow for these places, I think that's another added dimension. But it also benefits the IOC. And they're like, I loved how Priyansh said, a farce of this global harmony in doing that. And so to me, it's almost like a bridge of like sports washing, IOC washing, and greenwashing all coming together in these Olympics.
It might surprise you to hear that the 2029 Winter Asian Games were slated for Saudi Arabia. The Winter Games were slated for Saudi Arabia. Just recently, Saudi Arabia said, you know what? I know we got hosting rights, but we're not going to do that. They're sort of retooling their sports washing machine. That's another story. But to your point, who knows? I mean, if they're going to assign a Winter Asian Games, and usually those sort of smaller regional games, whether it's like the Pan Am Games here for the Americas or the Asian Games, are stepping stones toward the mega events. People call them mini mega events, and it shows, hey, we can do this at the mini mega level. Give us a mega event next. So actually, I don't think it's too far off. But, you know, the International Olympic Committee is limited now by, especially with the Winter Olympics, beyond the snow creation that you're talking about and the ridiculous possibilities of moving it to places like India or Saudi Arabia. They are limited by the fact that climate change is real, and there are fewer and fewer cities that are simply capable of hosting the Winter Olympics. And that's something that they know they have to grapple with moving forward.
Yeah, and these Milano-Cortina games, we've noted, I think we've all heard about, like, they're kind of been plagued by these massive infrastructure delays. In Canada, we've heard a million things about the hockey arena. And it's threatened. It's the fact that it might threaten our, beloved Canadian national game. But there's also been issues at the Cortina Sliding Center, cable cars, etc. In the capitalist logic of these mega events, delays usually mean speed ups for workers. They often lead to injury, they lead to exploitation, or at least justify some of those. We know that emergency decrees are a favorite tool of Olympic organizers. With venues like the Sliding Center and cable cars being so far behind schedule, does this kind of rush to finish impact workers on the ground? And are we seeing perhaps to put it differently, are we seeing a suspension of labor protections in the name of, speeding up a deadline here?
Yeah, thank you, Derek, for that important question. It's interesting to me, back in the 90s, even into the early 2000s, one of the perennial questions when we were getting ready for an Olympics to start was, will the venues be ready for it? I mean, you saw it in Rio de Janeiro as well. Will the venues be ready? That question is obviously important, but it distracts from all these other issues that we've been talking about: overspending, surveillance industry benefiting from it, displacement of local marginalized populations, greenwashing, corruption. But it also distracts from what you're talking about, which is that workers are involved in building these stadiums, and it can put their lives in jeopardy. There was a death recently at one of the places where they were building in Cortina when it was really cold. There's an investigation ongoing as to what was happening there. It's wild to me that they're still building just days before the Olympics are starting here in Italy. They had, I will say this though, because of the fact that more people are aware of this reality of worker danger and even worker death when it comes to building venues really quickly, right in time, there has been some real smart labor action on this. The Building and Woodworkers International Union reported significant gains in Italy in terms of worker safety and fairness in terms of their wages ahead of these Olympics. So I view these days the Olympics as basically a once-in-a-generation chance for organized workers to make significant gains. You know, when we were in Paris for the 2024 Olympics, we interviewed this guy from the CGT Rail Workers Union, a guy named Axel Persson, who detailed for us how his union made enormous gains. He was going to get to retire like 3 or 4 years earlier. Garbage workers are famous for using their strength right before Olympic Games, saying, hey, we're not going to pick up the garbage unless, and they get big gains as well. So if you have savvy unions, you can make gains. This is happening in Los Angeles, actually, where you have Unite Here 11 that is working toward this $30 an hour wage for people working in hotels that have more than 60 rooms. And they call it the Olympic wage. I resist using that, but I'm just going to say it because it's going to be part of the propaganda moving forward. I don't think it should be called an Olympic wage. I don't think the Olympics deserves anything for this. I think it's organized worker wage, maybe, is what it really should be called. Of course, organized business is pushing back on it and trying to limit the possibilities of that $30 an hour wage. But my point is just that is kind of a double-edged sword here. On one hand, workers definitely do get imperiled by having to work faster, longer hours to get these stadiums and other venues ready. On the other hand, with some foresight, like we're seeing in Los Angeles, like we saw in Paris, and like we saw to a certain degree here in Italy, it can be an opportunity for workers as well. I think that, well, for starters, like this notion of celebration capitalism hinges on the idea of the Olympic state of exception creates this moment of opportunity for well-positioned capitalists and political elites to really cash in on the Olympic spectacle where the general public tends not to. The security industry does, everyday people don't. Um, so I do think that in some ways, like we've been talking about, the script is kind of similar. But when you start to move toward the idea of sports washing and bringing that in, that's where I think that there is a lot, it's a very lively field where there's lots of possibilities for us to continue to learn and see new mechanisms at work, especially because like for a long time, I think what should be to the embarrassment of scholars, when people talked about sports washing, they were only waggling a finger at those other countries like Qatar, like Russia, that were considered to be authoritarian, whereas like Canada, the United States, we were just like incapable of that kind of thing because we were quote unquote democracies. I mean, first of all, the United States is moving toward what political scientists call the new competitive authoritarianism, marked by like sort of fake elections, sham elections, and all sorts of other problems. But setting that aside, certainly we're seeing sports washing happening in the context of the United States ahead of the 2026 World Cup and the 2028 Olympics. There's just like no question about it. If you define or you agree to the definition of sports washing being when political leaders use sports to deflect attention from chronic social problems and human rights woes at home in order to burnish national prestige and to set themselves up for political and economic gain, that's definitely happening. In the most crudest of fashions, it's happening right now. You're seeing the Trump administration, members of the Trump family, engaging in personal enrichment on a scale that should be shocking. I mean, the New York Times did a recent study that found that $1.4 billion had been made by Trump and his family since he took office in 2025 in January. So like that should be everyone's collective jaws should be dropping when they hear that. That's sort of becoming normalized, and it's becoming normalized through this sort of sports washing nexus. I mean, look at it's a symbiotic relationship. Trump is helping Saudi Arabia normalize its sports washing endeavors. Saudi Arabia is helping Trump normalize its sports washing endeavors. So as with most things, including your work, if you follow the money, you can get a long way in understanding these relationships. And I think what's interesting, it's like political spectacle meets just sort of brass tacks capital accumulation through this vector of sport. More people are realizing that it's actually a really interesting way of crystallizing some of these dynamics that make them comprehensible for even like a general audience to really think about. And so like that's why I'm really interested in continuing to pursue, along all of you in this here room and in this conversation, of these questions around how does global capital adjust, torque, figure out ways of moving its surplus capital from, say, fossil fuels to sport in ways that burnish reputation. I think those are all open questions where the answers aren't settled. And that's what makes scholarship in this field, I think, quite interesting right now.
I really want to pick up on this sports washing point you were making, because I loved how you framed it. That we've always talked about sport washing in the global south as if the global north is immune to it, right? Because like we're inherently part of this, like pristine liberal project that can do no wrong, right? When in fact, that's always been incorrect, right? And I think that's why there was even a fascism debate in the American context, for instance, is that many people rightfully pointed out, like this is a society founded on slavery and apartheid. There has always been this kind of like profound disregard and just general, exploitation, harm, everything else has been part of that project. So like, where is the line between something that's sort of novel as fascism and this kind of profoundly dehumanizing society that's always existed? And that was never acknowledged, right? In this discourse around sport washing historically, it was like China did this, Qatar did that, etc. And of course, we're rightly talking here about the whole point of this episode, this conversation, is to discuss 2026 in Italy. But I do think that you are sort of like naturally segueing us a little bit into something that I do want to like I want to engage with you while we have you here, right? Because you're this person you've literally written about No Olympics LA. You've really focused on these upcoming 2028 games and the, genuine social movement that has been arrayed against those games. And obviously, the IOC and the Olympic Committee has been successful and that the 2028 games are still on the books for Los Angeles, but the tides are shifting, right, again. And we have this new movement that is, I think, starting because of what's happened in Minnesota and elsewhere to lead people to sort of understand the point you're making about sports washing, that actually, like, we can't that the United States absolutely can sports wash, that it is a fascist regime, and that we have to start using the same strategies, the same language, the same sort of notion of boycotting, right? That actually is relevant to the US as well. And it's, of course, first, like, what people are paying attention to right now, and they should, and we're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of episodes talking about this on this podcast because it's so important, the World Cup, right? Coming up in 2026, this year, a few months away. But the LA Olympics are also on the agenda, right? And I'm really curious. So I know this is a long way of framing the question, but what I'm trying to get to is you have been following this for years. Are you noticing anything changing in terms of, like, maybe how you would have thought the 2028 games would play out from a political standpoint and from, like, a kind of popular resistance standpoint?
I think things are changing around the 2028 Olympics in terms of the discourse, in terms of the number of people that have opened their eyes to the problems around those games. Let's not forget that when the International Olympic Committee handed Los Angeles the 2028 Olympics some 11 years in advance, they were considered to be this safe pair of hands that was receiving the Olympics, given their Olympic history and so on, given it was supposedly, a stable democracy and all that. Well, wow, have things really changed since then? One of the consistent through lines, however, between 2017 when they got the games and today is the presence of a rambunctious, highly intelligent, politically educated group called No Olympics LA, which continues to fight against the Olympics in Los Angeles, but also beyond Los Angeles. And they've been a prime mover in the creation of this transnational group of activists around the world who are saying no to the Olympics. And they're not just saying no to the Olympics, they're saying no Olympics anywhere. So it's interesting to me to all of a sudden, these folks have been fighting hard, organizing at the community level with dozens of local groups who've signed on as coalition partners, from the LA Tenants Union to various groups, even in Long Beach, to Stop LAPD Spying, you name it. They have just tons of coalition partners. And now these other people that are not necessarily considering themselves politically radical are going like, whoa, the Olympics is starting to feel real. Wait, Casey Wasserman did what? His name was in the Epstein files how many times? Like, they're all of a sudden like, where do I go for information? Well, the No Olympics LA folks, they've got their website. They've been doing the hard political education work for a long time. So I think they're very well positioned to cash in. Here's the other thing, though. I've been studying anti-Olympics activism for a long time now. And what's different to me about the group in LA is the sheer level of talent they have in terms of propaganda making, meaning they have people inside of Hollywood who are filmmakers. Like, there's a person who was doing film for them who had his own Netflix film. I mean, like, this is talent. John Mulaney recently spoke out in one of his monologues against the Olympics, like, very vociferously. Well, he's been influenced by people who have been inside of that No Olympics group as well. There's a lot of writers that are in comedy rooms around Los Angeles who have ties to No Olympics LA. So I think that they're well positioned to cash in, and the world's attention is going to pivot to Los Angeles right after these Olympics, and maybe even pivot during the Olympics, given everything that's going on with the scandal of Casey Wasserman. But for me, what's exciting about the No Olympics LA group, among other things, is that they are just straight up radical, anti-capitalist, progressive thinking around all these issues in ways that I think the moment all of a sudden has sort of come to them. And I'll be really interested to see what they do with it.
So I'm teaching in Florida, and I feel like you want to talk about propaganda and the disinformation that circulates. We are in the bed of it. But I think what's really encouraging to me is so this past fall, I taught an ethics in sport class, and one of our lectures, actually, Jules, we read your piece for the sociology of sport on sports washing. And my exam question was on sports washing, and to give an example of, like, we'll define the term, blah, 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 like, give an example of this. And actually, most of my students talked about in the US, President Trump using sports washing, which I thought was a really important thing of these students. Of all the choices they could have picked, they talked about President Trump using sports washing at an NFL game with the LA Olympics. And so I think this idea of continuing to educate and keep fighting this fight and raising this awareness about it, your work does a brilliant, brilliant job of this, but also the No Olympics movement too. Some of my students were like listening to podcasts about it and Googling it and talking about it. And so I think that I really hope that this movement continues to grow and awareness of the problematics and these issues continue to percolate and push through the noise of everything in this. So
That's really gratifying. Thank you.
Jules, I just have one last question before we fully close. So it's the end of February 2026. What are we going to be talking about in terms of the legacy of the games?
Well, I think it really depends on what happens, but we could. I know there's these protests that we've been talking about that are going to be in the streets. So one legacy could be an enlivened activist scene in Milan. When they do that march the day after the opening ceremony, they're deliberately taking the march to areas of Milan that have been gentrified by the Olympic Games. That could further the ties that they're building in the community. I mean, when I did research and writing around the 2010 Vancouver Olympics, I was up there in Vancouver, not too far from where I live in Portland. And one of the things that activists told me was that a legacy of those Olympics was that these folks that really were doing their own kind of things in gentrification, public spending, policing, homelessness, they were brought together during that Olympic moment. They really came to like each other, and then they'd show up for each other afterwards in solidarity. So, kind of an underbelly legacy, one that I think is really important and hopeful, could emerge out of Italy. It all depends on kind of what happens around the activism there. I think it's also going to be really interesting to see how athletes from the United States, but also around the world, respond. Maybe they can wedge open space for athletes to speak out at the Los Angeles Olympics by taking courageous stands. Those are just two of the things that I'm thinking. I'm really hoping that in this hyper politicized moment that the Olympics don't become a terrorist target. I mean, let's not forget 1996 in Atlanta. Let's not forget the fact that Doku Umarov, a Chechen rebel, said that the Sochi Olympics were a perfectly legitimate terrorist target. I don't see a lot coming for Italy itself, but this is a chance to really kind of put your name out there, and I'm very concerned about that. So like, it all depends what happens. Like these could be Olympics that are known for one thing that we won't even ever fathom in this conversation, even though we've all been thinking about the Olympics a lot. And maybe that's one reason to tune into these Olympics to a certain degree. But I'm eager to find out with the rest of you kind of what we're going to be thinking about on the way out and think through this with the rest of you. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you all today, and I really admire the work that you all are doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's always amazing to have you on the show. There's no one else when we think about the Olympics to chat about than Jules Boykoff. So we thank you so much for spending this time with us, and maybe we'll reconnect after the Olympics for a debrief if you're open to that.
Sounds good.